Nadav Eyal, thank you for joining me. Nadav is a senior columnist at Yediot and an adjunct professor at the School of International Affairs at Columbia University. And he's joining here to give us a brief overview of what's happening right now in Israel regarding the ceasefire and the hostage deal. Nadav, thank you for joining me. Please tell me, first of all, what's in the deal?
Well, when we're recording this, just less than an hour ago, 3 female hostages, civilian hostages that were held by Hamas for more than 470 days have been handed over through the Red Cross to the IDF, and now they are safely back in Israel. And that is the end of their terrible ordeal of captivity with Hamas. And this is really the first phase of a possible hostage and ceasefire deal in Gaza. So these 3 female hostages are going to be followed in a week's time with other hostages, also female hostages this time, soldiers that are going to be released. And this is a sort of a schedule for the next 42 days in which you will see a ceasefire in Gaza. The IDF still retaining some of its positions within the strip, and you'll see the release of 33 Israeli hostages, most of whom are alive.
So we're recording this on January 19th. That's Sunday, the start of the week in Israel, and this is really the beginning of what is supposed to be a first phase of a hostage deal. Can you explain the basic framework that the deal offered, and what are the phases, and what can we expect from each phase?
So there are big 3 phases for this deal, and nobody knows if the second 2 will actually be implemented. So let's begin with the first one. The first one is a 42 days ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, in which, as I said, 33 Israeli hostages are to be released. Israel has good intelligence that at least 23 to 25 of these hostages are alive. Israel would have never gone through this deal if they would have thought that most of the hostages are dead, but Hamas would never give even a proof of life or any guarantee that these hostages are alive. This is right now seen as mostly a humanitarian deal. So the people to be released are people that Hamas and Israel agreed that are on the humanitarian list. That means Israelis that are over 50, some of them are in their 80s, women, both soldiers and civilians, and people who were badly injured either during their time of captivity in the Gaza Strip or when they were taken hostage by Hamas in its attack on Israel on October 7. During this time, Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip will be able to return to their lands in the center and northern parts of the Strip, areas that have been the scene of very aggressive fighting between the IDF and Hamas fighters. And most of the population has evacuated itself or has been evacuated from these areas to more the center and the southern parts of Gaza. So beginning yesterday, actually, Palestinian civilians can return back to their land, and this is going to expand. The routes in which they can go back to their houses is going to expand, and the IDF is actually withdrawing from most of the Gaza Strip, and that's the first phase. In the second phase, the rest of the hostages are to be released, and if this deal goes through, you will still see more than 60 hostages, Israeli hostages, held by Hamas. This time, according to Israeli intelligence, they're not that optimistic about the percentage of them who are actually alive. We don't know yet. And during that second phase, there will be further release of Palestinian prisoners convicted for terror activities from Israeli jails. And you'll see some sort of negotiations towards a final ceasefire in the Gaza Strip between Hamas and Israel. That's the second phase. And the third phase, if we will ever come to that, is the rebuilding of Gaza and a general understanding, I don't want to say an agreement, as to what's going to happen in Gaza the day after.
So the ratio right now of Israeli hostages to Palestinian prisoners, Hamas prisoners primarily, is what, around 1 to 5? 1 to 50?
It really depends how you calculate this, but it's less than 1 to 50. So in this deal, you'll see the actual release of about 1,200 people. Some of the people who are being released are, the context is very humanitarian. For instance, the agreement is that for the bodies that Israel will receive, Israel will only release Palestinian women that were not combatants, captured during the fighting, and maybe teenagers that were captured during the fighting that are not combatants and are held by Israel. But Israel is not going to release Palestinian prisoners convicted of terror activity for the bodies. Because Israel doesn't know, and Hamas won't say how many of the 33 are alive, or Israel does have a good idea, but it doesn't know for sure. The general agreement here is of a number, and it's about 1,200 people per 33 hostages, but again, some of them are not alive. And Israel, in principle, is not paying, quote unquote, for Israelis that were killed by Hamas.
How different was this deal compared to the deal that was supposedly in consideration in May?
It's not that different. It's not that different than the deal in May. I would point out two main issues. The first issue is that the IDF stays in the Gaza Strip at the first phase of the deal, more so than it was supposed at the May deal. But it's not that substantial. And another element is that more Israeli hostages and live Israeli hostages are to be released in this deal. The argument that the Israelis would make in that reference is that Hamas never agreed truly to the May or July proposals by Biden and Netanyahu. That would be the main argument made by the Israelis, that it's a similar deal, but the problem was Hamas. And they have the Biden administration, Secretary Blinken, the president, Bert McGurk, and others who are saying this is the case. And they have been saying this is the case not since we have had this deal that people are hearing about in the news, but since the summer, and specifically since, I'd say, September. The Biden administration has been saying that Netanyahu wants a deal, that the deal is possible, and that the problem is with Hamas basically trying to sabotage these efforts. There'll be many people in Israel criticizing the government and saying that it is Israel that could have done more to get to a deal. But it's absolutely sure that Hamas wasn't as motivated. And I should remind the people listening that Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas that Israel killed during the summer, has said after the first hostage deal back in November 2023 that there will be no more deals with Israel until the war has ended and the IDF has left the Gaza Strip. Obviously, the IDF has not left the Gaza Strip. And as to the war has ended, there is no actual commitment in the agreement signed by Israel that it will not resume the war. And it is the intention right now of the Israeli right wing and the prime minister to resume the war. So they didn't get that. But these were the most principled efforts. It's not about the Palestinian terror activists, prisoners they wanted released. This was less their aim in these negotiations. It was about stopping the war and getting international guarantees that the war will never resume. And they didn't get that.
And is this change, you think, by your estimate, more the result of the gains that Israel has made, or Israel's persistence in the months after May, in the 6 months that followed, or the fact that we have a different American president?
So I think it's both. First of all, I need to credit President Trump and the incoming administration, I should say the administration now when we're recording this, for making the threats and the ultimatum they made. I don't think that
He's famously tweeted out that there'll be hell to pay if there is no deal before he comes into office, and his inauguration is in fact tomorrow.
So I think that was extremely effective in the region, not vis-a-vis Hamas, by the way, because Hamas, and we basically know that Mohammed Sinwar, the brother of Yahya Sinwar, another leader of Hamas, we know that they were going, what else can the Americans do to us that Israel has not been doing anyway? But it was about Qatar feeling the heat. It was about Egypt. And it was about the entire region sort of condensing itself to be on the good side with a new American president like Donald Trump. So I think this was extremely effective and probably saved lives.
How much of this is also pressure that Trump put on Netanyahu?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We know for a fact that Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy to the region, was extremely resolved, if not aggressive, in his conversations with Netanyahu, that the president has sent him to the region to get a deal. And he's not going to return to the US with no deal. And, there are two schools of thought here. One is that Netanyahu wanted this pressure, and the other is that he caved to the pressure. I'm more of the first school of thought. I do think that it is a political interest of Netanyahu to get a deal at this time. And I've written this before Steve Witkoff was sent to the region. But at any case, there is no doubt that...
Well, when you say he needed this pressure, you mean in order to say to his more extreme right-wing coalition, look, my hands are tied, and basically give himself the cover to take a deal that his coalition partners might not like?
Yeah. The thing here was to use external pressure as an alibi for why you need to go through the deal. And I think that this was extremely important for Netanyahu to go to his coalition and say, look, we don't want to pick a fight with the new US president on a deal that we ourselves suggested and offered. And I think that's a very viable argument. But generally, I think there's no way that we would have come to the release of the Israeli hostages without the military pressure employed by Israel. Now, some people in Israel will debate my last statement, mostly left-wing, writers and others who have been very critical of the government. And I've been very critical of the government, the way that it's been running the war. But they would say, no, we could have gone to this point before. But what I'm hearing from my security and intelligence sources, and are not big fans of Netanyahu, to say the least, is that it was military pressure that convinced Hamas that they need to stop now and not wait until some sort of a divine intervention will happen and Israel somehow is being pushed to leave the Gaza Strip and actually lose the war, and only then begin a lengthy negotiation as to release of Palestinian prisoners. Look at the pattern of release of Israeli hostages from terror groups in the past. Look at Gilad Shalit. It took years with Gilad Shalit, that soldier that was captured by Hamas at the time. Look at the Jibril deal. Jibril deal is a deal done with another terror group in the 1980s, and it entailed the release of thousands of Palestinian prisoners, thousands. In a higher key of release per Israeli hostage than we are seeing today. So when you look at the history, it is the pattern of these organizations to make the negotiations, as lengthy as possible and hold these cards, because they also supply them with some defense as human shields to an extent. And also because they know that the Israeli society is very focused on the return of hostages, and the value of solidarity is sacrament in Israeli tradition. So they knew that as time goes by, they might get more for the hostages they're holding. Not at this war. In November, right after the IDF entered the Gaza Strip, they went for the first deal. It was quite extensive, and more than 100 hostages released at the time. And now they went again to a deal more than a year after. If they would be left to their own devices, and Israel would have done what its critics wanted it to do, which is basically, bomb a bit Gaza, then say, okay, let's negotiate and let the Hamas rule just stay there. This is basically, I think, this was basically the argument. If not, just announce that it is completely surrendering to Hamas and decided to disintegrate the country, which is what I feel sometimes when looking at the demonstrations in the US is basically the demand. But let's say the demand is just, yeah, we could understand that you would have some sort of a response to that. But why did you need to go into war? Why did you go into Gaza and the rest? If that would have been the case, there's absolutely no doubt that Hamas would have held to these hostages for years to come. And this conflict would have lasted years until we would have seen them, if at all, because they would say, why? If we managed to get 1,000 prisoners for one Israeli soldier a few years back, that is the Shaliti, 1,017 Palestinian prisoners, hundreds of which with blood on their hands, arch terrorists like Yahya Sinwar himself. Why shouldn't we wait this out? Even if the Israeli hostages die in our tunnels, what do we care? They're willing to release so many people, we can empty their jails. And that is basically the logic of Hamas even today. They will try to hold to the remaining hostages as much time as they can because they are, A, human shields to their rule to an extent, and secondly, because they believe they'll get more for them as time passes by.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, the main impact of the continued military intervention from between May and today, January 19th, was to show that the pressure is going to continue and Israel is not going to capitulate. You're not going to get a better deal. Does that, in your assessment, justify the extended operations and the strife that it has caused the civilians in Gaza? Do you think militarily this has achieved something beyond sending that message?
Yeah, well, basically that's the problem is the assumption in the question. Israel has two aims in this war. One aim is to end the Hamas rule in Gaza, and the other one is to get the hostages back. It's not only about the hostages. So if you would come to the Israeli public and would say, okay, you're going to get all the hostages back, and Hamas is going to continue on controlling Gaza, and it's going to be life as usual, and the communities in the south will need to live with this, and we need to prepare to another surprise attack of October 7th, this time maybe, I don't know, wider. I think that most Israelis would say that that's a big problem. In this dilemma, I'm not sure what the Israeli public would have done. What Israelis want is the war to be over, Hamas not to rule Gaza, and the hostages back home. The thing is that the hostages' time is running out. They're dying because of the war. They're dying because Hamas is murdering them, like it murdered the six, among them Hirsch, Goldberg, Polin, an American citizen. So the logic here was, let's get the hostages back first. But the purpose of the entire military pressure in the Gaza Strip and this war is to make sure that Hamas can't have another October 7th. Even if it exists within the Palestinian society, it doesn't have the same capabilities it had prior to October 7th, and to an extent that Hamas cannot rule Gaza. And I am going to bet that this war aim is not going to go away. I think that if people either in Gaza, around the world, or in the US think that Israel is going to live with Hamas as a government in Gaza, and by government, I mean truly, it doesn't mean that if you come with a sort of a fake agreement that has a bureaucrat government and Hamas is actually running the show. I mean, Hamas running the show in Gaza, my assessment even today is that it's not going to fly with the Israeli public or with basically any Israeli government. Israel simply cannot guarantee the security of its citizens if across the border there's a genocidal fundamentalist organization that is on the record dedicated to the idea of its eradication and has proved on October 7th that it is extremely effective, when the IDF just fails for like 7 hours.
But what is the alternative that we're now contemplating? The Palestinian Authority taking over Gaza Strip?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of models there. One model is to have some sort of an international body that is holding Gaza in a mandate for the Palestinian people, the Palestinian Authority taking Gaza. One of the crises during this war, and one of the points in which I've been extremely critical of the Netanyahu government, is that they did not have a day after plan, which is pretty amazing because it's obvious that Hamas is part of the Palestinian society. Unfortunately, and not a compliment, I think, to the Palestinian society in whole. It's a grassroots movement, very popular within the Palestinian society. And in order to tackle that, you need a different force to control Gaza, or a decision by the Israelis that they're going to have a military rule occupation of Gaza.
Right. So versions are assuming that there is not going to be any tolerance for a resurrected Hamas government. The three options are some kind of international mandate, as you put it, which would probably imply a combination of the Arab League and Western powers, or the Palestinian Authority under the sclerotic Mahmoud Abbas government taking over Gaza after having been kicked out, murdered, and defenestrated from Gaza in 2006-07, or Israel starting a whole new set of military rule in Gaza.
At no point Israel decided that it wants to control the civilian life in Gaza. For instance, make sure that schools are operating, build an administration, a military occupation administration, and the rest. Israel decided not to do that. And there's a fourth possibility, Adam, and that possibility is that Hamas will retain its control of Gaza. In the next 42 days, and after more than a year and 4 months, in the next 42 days, Hamas are the rulers of Gaza and the Palestinian population in Gaza. And you see them already in the streets celebrating their holy victory as they see it. So
this is that question. So this is actually my question. Given that no international force actually gave any indication that they'd be willing to participate in some kind of temporary mandate solution, given that we don't necessarily have good reason to trust that the Palestinian Authority will be able to actually establish a new regime in Gaza, and given that I think at least half of Israeli society, I would assume the majority of Israeli society, is not remotely interested in establishing a new kind of civilian occupation in Gaza, what are we left with? And add to that the fact that with starting to talk about the moral hazard of this deal, Hamas emerges empowered in its own mind, at least in the way that it is able to message the result of the deal. You know, it's been a cliche that if Hamas is able to come out out of the tunnels, raising the V signs after any kind of ceasefire, Israel is seen to have lost. And in the logic of what is millenarian, eschatological, and even suicidal fundamentalist organization, that's a win. No matter what wreckage Israel has left behind, Hamas leaders are able to come out, those that have survived, raise their hands in a V sign and claim victory. So why shouldn't we just expect that we're sliding back to pre-October 7th regime in Gaza?
Well, unfortunately, we should always expect that if this is the condition right now. Look, I think that we need to differentiate between an image view of reality, an image-driven view of reality through social networks, and between their reality. And the reality is that Gaza is devastated. And I don't think this is a win for Israel, that Gaza, as home to these people, is devastated. But the war has devastated Gaza. It's just a fact. Hamas has definitely not won the war. They have been hiding in their tunnels. I know that many people who support Yahya Sinwar and this terrorist organization will point into the last moments of Yahya Sinwar saying, he fought till the end and he wasn't underneath the ground. Well, he wasn't underneath the ground because Israel took those tunnels. And during taking those tunnels, by the way, Hamas murdered those 6 hostages because they were fearing that Israel is going to enter the tunnel. So Yahya Sinwar tried to hide in plain sight. But basically, this is where they came from. They came from their tunnels. And also, by the way, Adam, they came from regions in Gaza that Israel never entered. And one can only speculate that the reason that Israel never entered those camps is because it is these areas in which the hostages are being held. So to try and portray this as a victory after Hamas had like 12 regiments before October 7, and now it holds about 1.5. Or even I heard this report that the Americans are saying that they managed to recruit as many people who were killed. Well, this is the kind of report coming sometimes from American intelligence, which I find heavily politicized, because recruiting people to Izzadin al-Qassam, to Hamas armed militia, from 16-year-old and giving them rifles is not the same as those trained Nukhba elite force of Hamas that invaded Israel. It's a different story. And from the conversations I have with both aid organizations that operate within the Gaza Strip and Palestinians in the Strip know full well the immense disaster that was the result of October 7th. Now, does it matter? That's a good question, because when you're ruled by authoritarians, and Hamas is fine, there's no doubt that what they are having is a theocracy, an authoritarian theocracy in the Gaza Strip. There is you won't see articles in Gaza newspapers or website criticizing Hamas at all for anything, right? As far as Hamas is concerned, as far as the Hamas Health Ministry is concerned, there is no one Izzadin al-Qassam fighter that died during the war. They're only publishing the names of Palestinians that were killed, arguing that they're all civilians, right? They didn't lose even one fighter, as far as they are concerned, besides Yahya Sinwar, who died a holy death. So you see that this question of perception, when you are ruled in such a dictatorship, is a huge one. For Israel, in terms of deterrence, the answer lays with what happened to the entire axis of resistance. So you see what happened to Hezbollah. You see what happened to Bashar al-Assad. You see how Iran is, to an extent, deflated. What are the support mechanisms for Hamas today? Before October 7, it was Iran. It was Hezbollah. It was, to an extent, Qatar. It was, to an extent, Israel, that allowed Palestinian daily workers, dozens of thousands, to come and work in Israel, believing this will enshrine peace and security to an extent, and understanding with the Hamas regime. All of this is gone, politically speaking, just factually gone. They don't get that anymore. And also, you have a UN Security Council advisor, Mike Waltz, saying on the record, you need to uproot this cancer. Hamas can rule Gaza. I just read a piece in the NBC saying that the U.S. administration, and maybe Steve Witkoff, is considering moving Palestinians to Indonesia. These kind of ideas, I don't think, and the situation in Gaza, don't give an impression of an actual victory. Will they say it's a victory? Of course they will. Of course they will. But you only need to look at what happened to Gaza. And by Gaza, I mean the fighting force of Hamas. Look, according to the most careful estimates, they lost dozens of thousands of their apparatus during this war. And that's a lot in a 2 million people arena, political arena. Is it enough for Israel to say that it won the war? Absolutely not. First of all, because the hostages are still there, at least some of them. And even after this phase of the deal, they will be there. That's one aim of the war. Secondly, because Hamas right now is ruling Gaza. So that's another aim of the war. And the best answer to who won, so simplistically, is that the jury is still out on this one. If in 3 years from now, you'll see a Hamas regime in Gaza, and God forbidding, not all the hostages will be back home, Israeli hostages, that means that Hamas has won. But if you'll see a different Palestinian society, and you'll see Hamas reduced and not the type of militia, fundamentalist militia it is today, then it's a different story. And for this, you need to have a strategic planning across the region with the United States, and mainly for Israel to decide what it wants, which I think it didn't decide. And this is one of the reasons. If you don't plan ahead, I think there's a great quote by President Eisenhower, who said, plans are irrelevant, but planning is everything. And I think to an extent, Israel hasn't been doing enough planning during this war, although it was warned by the Biden administration that it should plan for the day after.
So talking about the Netanyahu government, Ben Gvir, the far-right member of government who was head of the self-fashioned Office of Police, former terrorist himself, Jewish militia terrorist, has said that he will resign if the deal goes through, and has, in fact, resigned, right, from government. What does that mean to the future of the Netanyahu government, and what does it mean, not just in terms of the stability of the coalition, but also for any kind of insight into what direction Israel is going to take about the future of Gaza?
Okay. So Itamar Ben-Gvir is indeed a far-rightist Kahana disciple and convicted for incitement for violence, although not with, I don't think he was convicted for actual terror offenses, but at any rate, he's not far from it. And him leaving the government is, of course, very bad news for Netanyahu, because Netanyahu needs the far right as his base. And this is one of the reasons why, if I need to bet right now, if Netanyahu is going to go through with the second phase, which is to have another hostage and prisoner deal and actually end the war, I'm not sure about that, because I'm not sure he's going to survive this politically at all. And there's a lot of rejection within the Israeli right wing, and you don't need to be far right to reject the deal. Many people reject the deal. Many people think the deal is a mistake, and they point out to data. For instance, the data of the Israeli security service, the Shabak, that says that 80%, and they supported the deal. The Shabak was negotiating the deal, and they're also saying 80% of the Palestinian terrorists that Israel has been releasing in deals have, returned to be terror activists, and they employ themselves with terror actions. This idea that releasing terror prisoners from jail leads somehow to reconciliation, it's simply not supported by the data. And it doesn't matter if this is during war or peacetime. With the Shalit deal, you're not in the middle of a specific conflict. Yahya Sinwar was released in the Shalit deal, and then he had this dream, this messianic idea that he is the messenger who will bring about the demise of the state of Israel, and led the entire region to a catastrophe. And it's not a singular case. So it's a huge question for the Israeli right wing. But by the way, not only the right wing. Okay, now these Palestinian prisoners are released, many of whom are released to the West Bank. Hamas wants a third intifada in the West Bank. This was a strategic cause of Hamas. And also, what does it mean about the war aims? What does it mean about the future of Israel in the region? Their argument is it's really important to release the hostages, but if you release them and you put the entire country at risk because your deterrent force is not there anymore after you have made such huge sacrifices of really the number of Israeli soldiers that have died. Again, if you listen to sometimes American media, and definitely if you listen to protests, you don't know that there is a war in the Gaza Strip, that the Israeli soldiers got killed on a daily basis, that there are armed confrontations, right? It's being portrayed as a unilateral Israeli activity with absolutely no resistance by Hamas, who are these humanitarians just keeping the hostages or something. But there's a war there, and the Israeli right wing, and not right wing, is saying, what have they died for? Of course, the answer is, among other things, they have sacrificed their lives to release the hostages and to disintegrate those regiments of Hamas so that there will be no threat. But what does it mean for Israel in the region? And because of that, to a large extent, I think that Netanyahu's career is really at stake here, because the right wing in Israel has had enough. They're saying, look, you said we're going to have an absolute victory. This is your quote, Nitzachon Muchlat in Hebrew, an absolute victory. Where's the victory? Where is it? And you also said we are on the brink of an absolute victory, and you said that months and months ago. Well, we were on the brink. Did you lie back then? So Ben-Gvir leaving government is really essential in understanding that Netanyahu needs to prove his worth again to the Israeli right wing. And I'm not sure he can do that. I'm not sure he can do that, all considering what's happening in the region right now, and Trump pushing for a possibility of a second phase of the deal. So it's really up to Trump. If Trump is resolved that there's going to be a second phase of this deal, it's a whole different ballgame. And I'm not sure that Netanyahu can survive it.
Where does that leave us? Because, okay, so part of the argument of the right wing, there is the we didn't get full victory. Also, there is the moral hazard, right? You're only incentivizing, like the Shalit deal incentivized in some ways October 7th. Now you're incentivizing them to rearm, and in 10 years, perpetrate a broader scale kidnapping. I think the logic from Hamas's perspective, the one thing that worked well for Hamas was kidnapping civilians, right? The slaughter didn't gain them much, except an Israeli rage and a willingness to commit to the war longer. But kidnapping civilians has gave them all the leverage in the world, and now they know just how powerful that tool can be. So for moral hazards and for the ambiguity of victory, as we've discussed sufficiently, the right wing does have a clear case of why this deal should leave people, at the very least, uneasy, regardless of how happy, obviously, everybody is in Israel about any single soul being released from that hell. But where does that actually leave us? So if we have the country who just wants to make sure that every single Israeli in Gaza is released no matter what, because they feel like they can't survive another day there, and there is nothing more to be gained by withholding on a deal. And then there's another half that says any kind of deal, basically, shorn of complete surrender of Hamas, which is not likely to happen, is capitulation and will only lead to worse consequences down the line. Like, those are A, irreconcilable, and B, both totally unrealistic viewpoints.
It's even more complicated than that. And let me add another something to this, because I tried to present fairly the arguments against the deal. I myself support the deal. And the reason I support the deal is A, because you'll always have time, if your strategic aim is the downfall of Hamas, to make sure that Hamas doesn't rule Gaza. Israel is a strong state, and I think Israel can do that, but it needs a plan. Since it doesn't have a plan, one might ask the question, so why are you sacrificing the hostages? For what? If you do have a plan, and it will improve the lives of everybody in the region, including Palestinians, and will deter the region, but you don't have any plan there installed anyway. And hostages don't have time. And you always have the time. You'll have the time to make sure Hamas doesn't rule Gaza, as long as they are there. So that's a good argument, but it's not a perfect argument. I think that the most important argument, which I think that people sometimes struggle to understand in countries that are big, countries that have a lot of population, countries as secure as the United States, is that in a small country that fights for its own survival, solidarity, and by solidarity, I don't mean like trade union solidarity. I mean, I'm keeping your back and you're keeping my back. And these ideas are not a sentimental issue. They go to the strategic core of your ability to survive in a very, very difficult neighborhood. So if you have the People's Army, like the IDF, a mandatory army service, and you're not going to say to their parents, look, if your son, God forbid, falls hostages, again, this fundamentalist, cruel terror organization, will do everything to get him out. And by everything, we mean everything. Militarily, we'll employ huge force to do that, but also will make big concessions. If you're not able to say this to Israeli civilians and to Israeli soldiers and to their families, what are you saying? Everyone is to himself? Well, if everyone is to himself, what's the idea of the project called the State of Israel? Isn't this all about solidarity, and specifically solidarity of the Jewish people after being persecuted for thousands of years? And the answer to me is yes. So because of these two, I would say, overreaching arguments, I still support the deal myself. But these two arguments just make what you just said, Adam, more complicated, right? Because there's another thing in motion here, in principle and also strategically speaking, and it's a problem from hell. What do? You look at the United States and the amount of time and money and sacrifice that it has put into Afghanistan, which is so far away from U.S. shores, or to Iraq. What do you do when you have a society engulfed in enough fundamentalism for it to be overtaken by a destructive form of fundamentalism? Now, there was a lot of noise in the last year and a half about this, but I want to be as clear as I can, morally speaking, ethically. This war could have ended in 5 minutes if the Hamas regime would have said, we're willing to do what Yasser Arafat did in 1982. We're going to board ships in Gaza. We're going to leave Gaza to Turkey, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people. We're going to release the hostages, even in a deal with Palestinian prisoners, and the PA can take Gaza. Hamas would still exist in Gaza, by the way, because Hamas, again, is a grassroots movement of the Palestinian society, unfortunately. But they could have ended this war in 5 minutes before there were 1,000 Palestinian casualties, before hostages were murdered, before the entire region was engulfed, before the axis of resistance fell because of Israeli successful victories in the north and against Iran. They could have done that. They can still do this. They can still do this today. And I know I reported this about these Israeli proposals, and now we see that the Biden administration is saying on the record that Israel has made these proposals. I can't imagine any country in the world that after such a terror attack, specifically the United States, let's say after 9/11, would have said to Osama bin Laden or anyone else, oh, we're going to give you safe passage in order to prevent a war in Afghanistan or prevent a war in Iraq, or we're going to give some sort of an immunity because we want our hostages back, and this is the moral clarity needed. At the end of the day, I think we all saw the pictures of the release of these 3 female Israeli hostages. The only survivors I saw on those videos was those 3 Israeli hostages. These were the survivors there. What I saw around them was a celebration of thousands and thousands of civilians that were knocking on the car, together with what seemed to be very well-fed Hamas fighters that came from somewhere, probably from the tunnels. So this kind of moral clarity, I think, is very needed for the West, because it's a problem that we have no solution to. What are you supposed to do, even if Israel decides to have a military occupation of the Gaza Strip? Will it help? We know it won't. We know what happened to Israel in Lebanon. We know what happened to the US in Afghanistan and in other places. We know. And we do not have good answers to societies that are engulfed in this type of fundamentalism. And it's not about territory. It's not about, standard of living in Gaza. This is another lie that is being just again and again uttered in these arguments. That the life expectancy in Gaza on October 6th was higher than the life expectancy in Mississippi or in Alabama on October 6th. These kinds of, and if you look at the number of entries and the number of exits of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip through the Rafah crossing to Egypt just prior to October 7th, you see that it was I don't want to say an all-time high, but it was in a high of a few years. So this goes deep, deep into a dilemma of the West, if you even believe that there is such a thing as the West today, or how to tackle these issues. And I don't think Israel has answers. I don't think anyone else has answers. This was a long speech. Sorry for that.
A long speech to lead us to the point of we're kind of stuck. And I think it does come down to, as you put it, that without moral confidence and the willingness to back that kind of clarity with action from the West, this is not going to resolve itself. This is going to get back to the same twisted logic that creates this situation. I'm going to ask you one last question quickly.
I just want to say one sentence about this. I think it will be a disaster for the region. For the region, not for Israel. If at the end of the day, in a year time, Hamas is going to have its government in Gaza, it's going to be a terrible disaster, and it will lead to a wider war in which more people will get killed. And I worry about this. I think people don't understand. People sometimes want these things just to be over. And enough people have sacrificed their lives for this to be solved in a way in which the drivers, which are also economy and are also, dignity of Palestinians of Israelis and of the for this to have a conclusive result that will make sure that people who incite for violence and mass murder don't get their way. If we don't get that, it's just going to be a disaster. And we're going to see, they are promising on the record more October 7th, even now. So we need to assume that this is what's going to happen. And Israel will respond more aggressively. So you need to really solve this, or at least attempt to solve this, in order to have hope.
So my last question actually relates to this. Where does the deal as it is now, with uncertainty about whether there's going to be a second or third phase, where does that put the broader regional war with the axis of resistance or whatever you want to call them?
I think this is an excellent question because we don't know yet how these scenes and this argument that Hamas has won, that's very widespread within radical groups in the West and of course in Gaza, how this is going to transcend to the axis of resistance. The facts are that Lebanon is now a different country and that there is an attempt to disarm Hezbollah as a militia. And if this happens, of course, it's a different Middle East. The facts are that Iran is very exposed to a possible Israeli attack. They don't have their air defenses anymore. And Israel has shown considerable effectiveness in disintegrating the axis of resistance. I think that to an extent, we should keep in mind that the axis of resistance is a Shia axis of resistance. It's led by Iran. And what Israel is worried about, and what I'm saying now is not a speculation, but after conversing about this with security officials in Israel and others, is that the Shia axis of resistance led by Iran will be replaced by a Sunni jihadi axis of resistance. And there are many, many things happening at once. For instance, the possibility that those Islamic State prisoners held by the Kurds, the SDF, back in the north of Syria will be released because of Turkey trying to get hold of that. The Syrian regime, of course, is being controlled by the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra, who has turned to be a well-suited kind of portrays a new image. But I think, the proof is in the pudding and he'll be judged by his actions. The bottom line is, I don't think he has forsaken at least some of the jihadi notions, and specifically that he would want to retrieve the Golan Heights that were annexed to Israel. I think any Syrian would, by the way. I don't think it's a jihadi thing. It's a nationalist thing, but it's also a jihadi thing. So this result in Gaza could lead potentially to a renewed jihadi scene in the Middle East, this time led by Sunnis and not by Iran. But again, these are early days. Everybody is going to watch as to what's going to happen in 42 days. I remind the people listening that in November, Hamas and probably the rest of the world thought that Israel is not going to resume the war after a ceasefire and a hostage deal, and Israel did resume the war. The prime minister is basically saying we're going to resume the war. I would listen. I'm not sure it's going to happen. Much is dependent on what the Trump administration is going to order Israel to do. But I would listen to that sentiment of Israelis saying, we cannot have Hamas in control of Gaza. And I think the end of that sentence is, to an extent, and neither can you. And neither can you. And that is the biggest moral hazard, I think, to the West. Because if this is the case, what was this war about to begin with? And what does it mean? Next time that someone decides that because he is part of this kind of group or another kind of group, it is legitimate to have this campaign of mass violence and murder of the sort that we have seen on October 7th. What does it mean for international security? What does it mean for Americans and the rest?
Nadav Eyal, thank you so much for joining me and giving me way more time than we planned. I hope you have a good weekend.
Thanks very much.